Hello there everyone! Tonight we're delving into one of history's most curious and rather sobering truths, a time when people genuinely drank beer instead of water, simply because it was safer. Imagine that. A whole society surviving on ale, from dawn till dusk. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And please, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always wonderful to see people joining us from all corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps switch on a quiet fan for that gentle background hum. And let's journey together into the past. I was born in the year of our Lord 1328, in a town whose name you would not recognise now, though its walls still stand somewhere in the rolling country between York and Lincoln. My father worked the tanner's trade, and my mother kept a small alehouse in the front room of our timber-framed dwelling. The smell of fermenting grain and the sharper bite of urine used for softening hides mingled in the air of my childhood, so that even now, decades later, I cannot separate the scent of bread from the memory of leather, nor the taste of ale from the taste of survival itself. We drank beer because we could not drink water. I must tell you this plainly, though it sounds strange to ears accustomed to the clarity of wells and springs. The water in our town, as in every town I knew, carried something invisible within it, something that brought the fever, the loosening of the bowels, the weakness that preceded the final sleep. We did not understand this as you might understand it now. We knew only what we saw, that those who drank freely from the river often sickened, and that those who drank the ale my mother brewed, or the beer from the monastery, or the weak table ale that even children consumed from dawn to dusk, remained for the most part upright and breathing. Would you have drunk from that river? I ask this not to judge you, but to make you see what I saw. The River Witham ran brown and sluggish past our town walls, accepting everything we gave it, the waste from the tanneries, the refuse from the butcher's stalls, the contents of chamber pots emptied from upper windows at first light, and sometimes, after the sickness that took the air in summer, the quiet bundles wrapped in linen that we did not speak of openly. The river took it all and moved it slowly southward, toward the sea, though it never seemed to cleanse itself. In high summer, when the water ran low, a smell rose from it that made even the dogs turn away. Yet people did drink from it. The very poor, who could not afford even the penny a gallon ale, would lower their buckets on ropes and draw up that brown water, letting it settle overnight in earthen jars, hoping that whatever darkness it contained would sink to the bottom. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. I remember a woman named Marjorie, who lived 3 houses down from ours, a widow with 4 small children and no coin for anything but bread. She drew her water from the river every morning, and every autumn, when the rains came and stirred up what had settled in the riverbed, at least one of her children would begin the shaking, the sweating, the slow descent into the fever that walked among us. One year, 2 of them did not rise for the spring planting. The priest said it was God's will. My mother said it was the water. But let me return to the beginning, to the house where I was raised, because it is there that I learned what beer truly meant to us. Our dwelling stood on Micklegate, near the eastern wall, close enough to the Church of St. Mary that we could hear the bells mark every hour of labour and prayer. The ground floor was given over to my mother's brewing, and to the small public room where neighbours came to drink. Above, reached by an outer staircase of worn oak, were the 2 chambers where we slept, my parents in one, myself and my younger sister Agnes in the other. The walls were wattle and daub, packed with straw and horsehair, lime-washed once a year before Easter. In winter, frost formed on the inside of those walls, and we slept beneath every wool blanket and sheepskin we possessed. My mother's name was Joan, and she held the title of alewife, as did perhaps 3 dozen other women in our town. This was her trade, as vital as any man's, and she guarded it with a fierce attention to detail that I only understood years later. 3 times each week, she brewed. The process began before dawn, when the rest of us still lay in darkness. I would wake to the sound of her moving below, the scrape of the great iron pot being positioned over the hearth, the splash of water, not river water, mind you, but well water drawn from the monastery well, for which she paid a small fee each month, being poured into that pot to heat. By the time I descended the ladder, rubbing sleep from my eyes, the water would be steaming, and my mother would be grinding the malted barley between two stones, reducing it to a coarse meal that smelled of bread and earth and something sweeter, almost like honey, though we rarely tasted honey except at Christmas. The malt came from John the maltster, who lived beyond the north gate, and who kept a floor above his stable where barley was spread thin and allowed to sprout, then dried in the smoke of carefully tended fires. This process, the sprouting and the drying, transformed the hard grain into something that would yield its sweetness when steeped in hot water. Without malt, there could be no beer. Without beer, I am not certain our town would have survived. My mother would pour the ground malt into the steaming water, stirring it with a long wooden paddle that had been her mother's before her. The mixture thickened and darkened, and the smell that rose from it filled our rooms with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the smell of creation, of something being born from simple elements. Water, grain, heat, and time. She would let it steep, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, depending on the strength she wished to achieve. Then, using a cloth strainer suspended over a second vessel, she would pour the liquid through, separating the sweet amber wort from the spent grains. Those spent grains were never wasted. We fed them to our pig, when we had one, or sold them to neighbours who kept chickens or goats. Nothing was discarded in those days. We could not afford the luxury of a waste. The wort, once strained, was returned to the pot and boiled. This boiling, I learned much later, was part of what made beer safe. It destroyed whatever unseen corruption might have lingered in the water, rendering it harmless, transforming it into something that would not only fail to sicken us, but would nourish us, keep us upright through long days of labour. During the boil, my mother would add herbs, not hops, for those came later to our region, but a mixture called brewed, sweet gale, yarrow, wild rosemary, sometimes mugwort or heather, depending on what the season offered. These herbs gave the beer its bitterness, balanced the sweetness of the malt, and helped preserve it, though beer in those days did not keep long. What was brewed on Monday was drunk by Wednesday. What remained by Thursday had begun to sour. After boiling, the wort was cooled left to stand, sometimes overnight, until it reached a temperature that would not destroy the yeast. My mother kept her yeast as her mother had kept it, as her grandmother before that. A thick, foam-covered slurry stored in a sealed crock in the coolest corner of our cellar. This yeast was precious, passed down through generations of brewers, and its loss would have been catastrophic. I knew of an alewife in the next street who lost her yeast to a careless servant girl who used the crock for storing lard. The woman wept for 3 days and had to beg a start of yeast from a rival brewer, paying twice the usual price. When the wort had cooled, my mother would pitch the yeast, pour it in, and stir it gently through the liquid, and then the transformation would begin. Within hours, a thick foam would rise to the surface, and the whole vessel would seem to breathe, bubbling and sighing as the yeast consumed the sweetness and produced both the alcohol that made the drink safe and the subtle lightness that made it pleasant to consume. This fermentation continued for 2 or 3 days. Then the beer was ready. My mother would ladle it into jugs and serve it, still slightly cloudy, still faintly sweet, to whoever came to our door with coin or barter. The beer we drank daily was weak small beer, we called it, brewed from the second or third rinsing of the malt. It contained just enough fermented strength to make the water safe, but not so much that it clouded the mind or loosened the tongue beyond propriety. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, the elderly drank it. It was as common as bread, and nearly as necessary. A household without beer was a household in danger, for it meant drinking from the river or from wells that might be fouled by seepage, by the slow underground movement of waste from privies and graveyards, by the invisible corruption that moved through soil and stone. Stronger beer, the kind that could make a man unsteady after 3 cups, was brewed less frequently and sold at a higher price. My mother made a batch of it once a month for market day, when the Alicona would come to test and approve it. The Aliconner was appointed by the town authorities, and his duty was to ensure that no brewer cheated the public by watering the ale or charging excessive prices. He would arrive with a wooden stick, drink a sample from each batch, and make a mark on our doorframe if all was well. If the beer was too weak or too costly, penalties followed, fines, occasionally a day in the stocks for repeat offenders. My mother never cheated. She could not afford to. Her reputation was her livelihood. You might think beer was a comfort. It was not. It was survival. I recall the summer of 1348, though I wish I did not. I was 20 years old that summer, newly married to a wheelwright's daughter named Alice, and we lived in 2 rooms above her father's workshop, close to the market square. The air that summer was thick and still, heavy with a heat that seemed to press down upon the town like a wool blanket soaked in water. The river shrank to a sluggish trickle, and the smell from it became unbearable. People hung bunches of lavender and wormwood above their doors, hoping to ward off the corruption they believed travelled on the wind. Then the sickness came. It came from the south, they said, brought by merchants from the coast, from ships that had sailed from foreign lands where the sun burned hotter and the customs were strange. It began in London, we heard, and then in Norwich, and then it was among us. The fever that walked among us that summer was unlike anything we had known before. It struck quickly. A man might wake healthy and be unable to rise by nightfall. The signs were unmistakable: the shaking, the burning skin, the swellings that appeared in the neck and under the arms, dark and tender as bruised fruit. And then, within days, sometimes within hours, the final sleep. The priest told us it was God's punishment for our sins. The physicians, those few who dared remain in the town, spoke of bad air, of miasmas rising from the earth, from rotting matter, from the alignment of planets that had disrupted the natural balance of the humours. They prescribed bleeding, purging, the burning of aromatic woods. None of it helped. The sickness moved through our streets like an invisible reaper, taking whom it pleased, young and old, pious and profane, wealthy and destitute. Could you trust the water if it had taken your neighbour? We could not. And yet, in the midst of that terrible summer, something curious occurred. Those who drank deeply of beer, those who avoided water entirely, seemed to sicken less frequently. I do not claim to understand why. Perhaps it was chance. Perhaps there was some property in the fermented grain that offered protection, some strength borrowed from the yeast that laboured in the dark coolness of our cellars. Or perhaps it was simply that beer required boiling, and boiling destroyed what water carried. Whatever the reason, the demand for beer in that summer exceeded anything my mother, or any alewife in the town, had known. People came to our door not for pleasure but for desperation, willing to pay double or triple the usual price for a jug of even the weakest small beer. My mother brewed every day, without rest, until her hands were raw from stirring and her face grey with exhaustion. I helped her, as did Alice, though Alice was carrying our first child and should have been resting. We had no choice. To refuse to brew would have been to condemn our neighbours, and ourselves, to a thirst that might prove lethal. The monastery, which had always brewed beer for its own needs and for the surrounding villages, opened its cellars to the public, distributing beer freely to those who could not pay. The monks understood even then what we only half grasped, that beer was not luxury, but necessity, that in times of crisis, when the water itself became an enemy, the ancient practice of fermentation might be the thread that kept the community alive. By autumn, the sickness had passed, or seemed to pass. The air cooled, the rains came, and the river rose again, carrying away some of what had accumulated in the dry months. We counted our losses. Nearly a third of the town had been taken. Entire families were gone. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold. The priest held a mass funeral, blessing the common grave where so many were laid to rest together, and we returned to our work with the hollowed-out feeling of survivors, grateful and guilty in equal measure. Alice gave birth to our daughter in December of that year, a small, red-faced creature we named Joan, after my mother. The midwife who attended the birth advised Alice to drink ale freely, to strengthen her milk, and we complied, though by then we needed no such advice. We drank beer as we breathed air without thought, without question, because to do otherwise was unthinkable. Let me tell you about the monastery, for it played a role in our lives that extended far beyond the spiritual. The Abbey of St. Benedict stood half a mile outside the town walls, surrounded by fields that the monks cultivated with a precision that would have shamed most farmers. The abbey held the rights to the best well in the region, a deep stone-lined shaft that drew water from some underground spring, untouched by the corruption that plagued the shallower sources. This water was cold and clear even in summer, and the monks guarded it carefully. They used it for brewing, for their own consumption, and for a fee they allowed townsfolk to draw from it, though the fee was steep enough that only the wealthier households could afford it regularly. The abbey's brewery was a separate building, stone-built and cool, with great oak barrels lining the walls and a brew kettle so large that 3 men could have bathed in it simultaneously. The brother who oversaw the brewing was an elderly monk named Thomas, a man who had come to the monastery as a boy and who had spent 50 years perfecting his craft. His beer was renowned throughout the shire. It was said that the bishop himself, when he visited, would request Brother Thomas's strong ale above any wine. I met Brother Thomas when I was perhaps 14 years old. My mother had sent me to the abbey to purchase a start of yeast, as hers had begun to weaken and produce beer that was thin and unsatisfying. Brother Thomas received me in the brewery, and I remember standing in the doorway, overwhelmed by the scale of the operation. Where my mother brewed in a single pot, the monastery operated 4 great kettles simultaneously, producing enough beer to supply not only the monks but the entire network of villages that paid tithes to the abbey. Brother Thomas was a small man, bent with age, but his eyes were sharp and his hands steady. He did not speak much, and when he did, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. He led me to a corner where several sealed crocks stood, lifted the lid from one and allowed me to peer inside. The yeast was thick and creamy, smelling of bread and beer and something faintly animal, like wet wool. He ladled a portion into a smaller crock that I had brought, sealed it carefully with a waxed cloth and handed it to me. The cost was 3 pennies, a substantial sum, but worth every coin for the quality of that yeast. As I turned to leave, Brother Thomas spoke. "Tell your mother," he said, "that the yeast is a living thing. It must be fed and kept cool. If she treats it well, it will serve her all her days." I carried those words back to my mother, and she nodded solemnly, as if receiving a benediction. And it was true. The yeast from Brother Thomas served our household for the next 20 years, passed from our home to Alice and myself when we set up our own brewing, and from us to our daughter Joan when she grew old enough to marry and keep her own alehouse. The monks understood something that the rest of us knew only instinctively, that beer was a form of alchemy, a transformation of the base and common into the life-sustaining, and that this transformation required not only skill but a kind of reverence. They approached brewing with the same solemnity they brought to their prayers, and perhaps this was fitting, for beer and prayer both sustained us, each in its own way. I must speak now of something darker, though I have delayed it. In the winter of 1353, the well in the market square, the public well that served perhaps 100 families, became fouled. No one knew how it happened. Perhaps a dead animal had fallen in, or perhaps the seepage from a nearby privy had found a path through the earth and stone. Whatever the cause, the water that came up from that well began to smell faintly of rot, and those who drank from it began to sicken. The town authorities ordered the well closed and arranged for water to be brought in barrels from the abbey, but this was insufficient. The price of that water was beyond what most families could afford, and so they turned once more to beer. The alewives of the town worked without rest, but the demand was impossible to meet. Grain stores, which should have lasted until spring, were depleted by January. The price of malt rose until even a modest batch of beer cost more than many families earned in a week. I watched people make choices that winter that still haunt me. I watched a mother water down the beer she gave her children, until it was little more than flavoured water, hoping to make it last, knowing that the dilution removed whatever protection the fermentation had offered. I watched men sell their tools, their cloaks, their last possessions, to purchase beer for their households, and I watched, helpless, as the fever moved among us once more, taking those who had no choice but to drink from the remaining shallow wells or from the river itself. Alice and I were more fortunate than most. Her father's trade had brought us a modest prosperity, and we could afford to purchase beer, even at inflated prices. But prosperity brings guilt when those around you are suffering, and I found myself standing in the market square on a February morning, surrounded by neighbours with hollow eyes and thin children, feeling the weight of a jug of beer in my hand like a stone. A woman approached me. I did not know her name, but I recognised her face from the church and asked if I could spare half a cup for her daughter, who was shaking with fever. I gave her the entire jug. Alice scolded me that evening, not because she was cruel, but because she was frightened, because we had our own daughter to protect, our own survival to consider. But I could not have done otherwise. I'd seen too much. The well was eventually cleaned, though it required lowering a man on ropes into its depths to remove what had fouled it, a task no one volunteered for until the town offered a payment of 5 shillings, a fortune for a day's labour. When the man emerged, pale and retching, he would not speak of what he had found below. The well was blessed by the priest, and slowly, cautiously, people began to draw from it again. The sickness faded. Spring came. We survived. But something had changed in us. We no longer trusted the water, not completely, not even when it ran clear and cold. We had learned that safety was an illusion, that the very things we depended upon, the wells, the river, the rain that fell from heaven, could turn against us without warning, without mercy. Let me tell you what beer tasted like, because I think you cannot fully understand this story without knowing. It did not taste as you might imagine beer to taste now. It was neither crisp nor bright. It was cloudy, thick with sediment, faintly sweet from the malt and faintly bitter from the herbs. The small beer we drank daily was almost flat, with only the faintest suggestion of fermentation, and it was served cool but not cold, drawn from the cellar where the temperature remained constant throughout the year. Stronger beer, the kind brewed for festivals or for sale to travellers, had more character. It could be sour, if it had sat too long, or harsh, if the brewer had been heavy-handed with the herbs. But when it was fresh, when it came from a skilled brewer like my mother or brother Thomas, it was satisfying in a way that water never could be. It coated the tongue, filled the belly, and provided a warmth that was both physical and psychological. The warmth of knowing that what you drank would not betray you. We drank it from wooden cups or from earthen mugs, never from glass, for glass was far too costly. We drank it with every meal, with the morning porridge, with the midday bread and cheese, with the evening pottage of beans and turnips. We drank it while working, while resting, while celebrating births and mourning the final sleep. It was woven into every aspect of our lives, so thoroughly that to imagine a day without beer would have been like imagining a day without breath. Children were weaned onto small beer almost as soon as they could hold a cup. The very young drank milk when it could be had, but milk itself was suspect, for cows drank from streams and ponds, and who knew what corruption they took in. Beer was certain, beer was safe. I remember watching my daughter Joan, when she was perhaps 3 years old, sitting at our table with her wooden cup gripped in both small hands, drinking her morning beer with the same serious concentration she brought to every task. She was a solemn child, quiet and watchful, and she grew into a woman of the same temperament. She married a baker, a good man who kept his ovens burning through every hardship, and together they raised 4 children. I'm an old man now, and she visits me often, bringing bread and beer, and we sit together in silence, remembering. But I am wandering from my tale. Forgive me. Age makes the mind slip sideways, chasing memories like a dog chases shadows. The years passed, as years do, marked by the rhythms of brewing and harvest, of feast days and fasts. The town grew slowly, new families arriving to fill the empty houses left by the sickness, new trades establishing themselves behind the protection of our walls. The alehouses multiplied. By the time I reached my 40th year, there were perhaps 50 in the town, each marked by an ale stake thrust out above the door, a green branch to indicate fresh beer available within. The competition among brewers was fierce but generally respectful. A good alewife could make a modest living, enough to feed her family and set aside a few coins for illness or old age. A poor brewer, one whose beer was weak or sour or whose conduct was questionable, would find herself without customers and eventually without livelihood. The market was ruthless in its own way, though it operated on reputation and word of mouth rather than any formal regulation beyond the Alicona's periodic inspections. My mother continued brewing into her 60s, though the work grew harder with each passing year. The lifting of heavy pots, the standing for hours at the hearth, the constant stirring and straining, all of it took a toll on her body. Her hands became twisted with the joint ill, and eventually she could no longer grip the paddle with sufficient strength to manage the mash. She taught Alice everything she knew, and Alice took over the brewing, while my mother sat by the fire and offered advice and sometimes criticism, which Alice bore with patience I admired. My father passed from us in his sleep one winter night, simply failing to wake when morning came. We found him cold and still, his face peaceful, and we gave thanks that the end that came quietly had spared him suffering. He was buried in the churchyard of St. Mary's, and my mother lived another 7 years before joining him. I think often of my parents, of the lives they lived, constrained by circumstance and survival, yet dignified in their way. They asked for little enough food, a dry roof, the respect of their neighbours, the hope that their children would fare better than they had. They drank beer every day of their lives, as I have drunk beer every day of mine, and they never questioned this practice because there was nothing to question. It was simply how one lived. The town itself changed over the decades. Stone buildings replaced some of the timber-framed structures. The market square was paved with cobbles, making it easier to walk through the mud that had previously made winter passage nearly impossible. New wells were dug, deeper than before, and the wealthier households began to install private wells within their courtyards, paying dearly for the privilege but gaining independence from the public sources. Yet even with these improvements, even with the finest wells and the most careful maintenance, water remained unreliable. After heavy rains, after periods of drought, after any unusual weather, the quality of well water would shift, and people would sicken. Not everyone, not always, but enough to remind us that we lived at the mercy of forces we could neither see nor control. The church preached that these sicknesses were God's judgment, that purity of soul would protect the body. The physicians spoke of humours and balances, of the need to purge bad blood and restore equilibrium. But we, the ordinary people who brewed and drank and survived, we knew a simpler truth, that beer protected us when water would not, and that whatever the mechanism, divine intervention, natural property, or simple happenstance, we would be fools to abandon what had kept us alive. I am in my 80s now, an age I never expected to reach. I sit in the front room of the house that once belonged to my parents, the house where I was born and where I have lived most of my life. Joan brings me my meals and I eat them slowly without much appetite, washing everything down with the small beer she brews in the same copper pot my mother used 70 years ago. The taste is unchanged, the process is unchanged, the necessity is unchanged. Outside my window I can see the street, narrower than I remember it, though I know it is my perspective that has shrunk rather than the street itself. I watch people pass women carrying jugs to the alehouse, men hauling barrels, children running with wooden hoops, and I think about all the years, all the brewing, all the beer consumed in this town since I was young, thousands upon thousands of gallons, millions of cups poured and drunk and forgotten, all of it in service of the same essential need, to drink something that would not bring the fever, the loosening, the slow descent into the final sleep. We did not celebrate beer, we did not romanticize it, or write songs in its honor, as I am told people in other lands sometimes do. It was too ordinary for that, too necessary. You do not write songs about breathing, do you? You do not give thanks for every heartbeat. Beer was like that, fundamental, assumed beneath notice until its absence made itself felt. And yet, looking back across the span of my life, I realised that beer was the thread that bound our community together. The alehouse was where news was exchanged, where disputes were settled, where marriages were arranged and business conducted. The act of brewing was itself a communal affair, with women sharing yeast and advice, helping one another during the busiest seasons, maintaining standards that benefited everyone. The monastery's distribution of beer during times of crisis created bonds of obligation and gratitude that transcended the usual boundaries between religious and secular life. Water divided us into those who could afford the good wells and those who could not, into those who sickened and those who stayed healthy. Beer united us, for even the poorest household brewed at least weak small beer, and even the wealthiest drank from the same basic recipe, the same ancient method that had sustained our ancestors since time beyond memory. I wonder sometimes what our descendants will think of us, if they think of us at all. Will they understand that we were not drunkards, not fools, not people who chose beer over water from simple preference? Will they understand that we were people trying to survive in a world where the most basic necessities could not be trusted, where the water that should have given life too often brought its opposite? Perhaps they will not understand. Perhaps the world will change in ways I cannot imagine, and the dangers we faced will be conquered, and clean water will flow from every tap and fountain without fear. If such a world comes to pass, I will be grateful for those who inherit it, even as I mourn a little for the loss of understanding, the gap that will open between their experience and ours. But I do not think they should judge us harshly for drinking beer instead of water. We did what we had to do. We survived. And if our survival came at the cost of constant brewing, constant consumption, constant vigilance over the quality of our ale and the health of our yeast, then so be it. We paid that cost gladly, for the alternative was unthinkable. There is one memory I have not yet shared, and I suppose I must share it now, though it brings me no pleasure to recall it. In the year 1369, a drought came upon our region such as no one living could remember. The spring rains failed to arrive. The summer sun beat down day after day without mercy. The fields turned brown, the harvest withered, and by August the river had become a mere thread of moisture winding through cracked mud. The wells dropped lower and lower, and one by one they went dry. Even the monastery's deep well, which had never failed in living memory, gave only a trickle of water, barely enough for the monks' own needs. The brewers could not brew. Without water, there could be no beer. And without beer, we faced a crisis more severe than any sickness, for at least during the plague, some people had remained healthy enough to maintain the essential work of the community. But thirst afflicts everyone equally, and thirst drives people to desperate measures. The authorities opened the last remaining wells to public use without charge, but the water that came up was murky and foul-smelling, drawn from depths where it had sat stagnant for who knows how long. People drank it anyway. They had no choice. Within days, the sickness began, not the dramatic fever of the Great Plague, but a slower, more insidious illness that emptied the bowels and left its victims weak and grey-faced, barely able to stand. The monastery attempted to continue brewing with the small amount of water they could draw from their well, but it was insufficient. Brother Thomas, now ancient and frail, worked himself into exhaustion, trying to produce enough beer to distribute to the town. I saw him once during those terrible weeks, being helped across the abbey courtyard by two younger monks, his legs too weak to support him. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes a resignation that frightened me more than any anger or despair could have. People began to leave the town, seeking water elsewhere, though where they thought to find it in the midst of a drought that affected the entire region, I do not know. Carts loaded with household goods rattled through the gates, families departing for distant relatives, or for the uncertain hospitality of other towns. Some returned weeks later, having found conditions no better elsewhere. Some never returned at all. Alice and I stayed. We had nowhere else to go, and our daughter was married with children of her own. She could not easily uproot her family. We rationed what water we had, drinking as little as possible, eating foods that required no cooking to conserve what moisture we could. And we watched our neighbours do the same, all of us drawing closer to the edge of what we could endure. The drought broke in September, with rain so heavy and sudden that the streets became rivers and the dry fields could not absorb the water fast enough. The rain lasted for 3 days without pause, and when it ended, the wells began to refill. The brewers returned to their work with a fierce urgency, and within a week the smell of boiling wort once again filled the town. People wept with relief when they took their first drink of fresh beer, wept as if they had been granted salvation itself. Perhaps they had been. Brother Thomas did not survive to see the rains return. He passed in his sleep 2 days before the weather turned, worn out by his efforts to serve the community he had devoted his life to. The abbot told us that his last words were instructions for the management of the yeast, which he feared would be lost without proper care during the crisis. Even at the end, his thoughts were for others, for the continuation of the work that kept us alive. The monastery held a special mass in his honour, and the entire town attended, filling the nave and spilling out into the courtyard. We sang the hymns for the departed, and we prayed for his soul, and when it was done, the abbot announced that the abbey's brewery would be renamed in Brother Thomas's memory, and that his methods would be preserved and taught to every novice who entered the monastery, so that his knowledge would not perish with him. I think of Brother Thomas often, especially now in my old age. He was a man who understood his purpose and fulfilled it without complaint, without seeking recognition, with only the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done. He brewed beer, and in brewing beer, he saved lives, not dramatically, not in ways that would be recorded in chronicles or remembered in songs, but truly, nonetheless. How many thousands of people drank the beer he made over his 50 years of service? How many of them lived longer, healthier lives because of his skill and dedication? We owe debts we can never repay to people we barely remember. This is one of the hardest truths of life. The years after the drought were years of rebuilding, of slowly regaining what had been lost. The population had declined, and it took a generation for the town to recover its former size. New families arrived, drawn by the availability of empty houses and cheap rents. New alehouses opened, new brewers established themselves. The cycle continued. I retired from active work in my 60s, though I continued to help Alice with the lighter tasks of brewing, grinding the malt, tending the fire, bottling the finished beer. My hands were still steady enough for these duties, though I could no longer lift the heavy pots or stir the thick mash. Alice was patient with me, allowing me to contribute what I could, never making me feel useless or burdensome. She passed before me, my Alice, taken by a sudden illness that gave no warning and allowed no farewells. One morning she complained of a pain in her chest, and by evening she had ceased to rise. The priest assured me that she had gone to God, that her soul was at peace, but I found little comfort in these words. I missed her physical presence, the sound of her moving about the house, the touch of her hand in mine, the shared silences that long marriage makes possible. I missed the way she hummed while brewing, a tuneless sound that had nevertheless become the music of my days. Joan took over the brewing entirely after her mother's passing. She had learned well, and the beer she produced was as good as any Alice had made, perhaps even better, for Joan had a natural instinct for the work that went beyond mere training. She knew by smell when the wort had boiled long enough, by touch when the mash had reached the proper consistency, by taste when the fermentation had progressed to its ideal point. These are skills that cannot be taught, only discovered within oneself, and Joan possessed them in abundance. I became a fixture in the alehouse, an old man warming himself by the fire, drinking small beer and watching the world continue without requiring much from me. People would nod to me respectfully as they entered, and occasionally someone would sit beside me and share news or ask my opinion on some matter of brewing or town affairs. I gave what advice I could, though I suspected they asked more out of courtesy than genuine need for my wisdom. The town continued to change around me. A new bridge was built across the river, replacing the old ford that had served for centuries. The market expanded, and merchants from distant places became regular visitors, bringing goods we had never seen before, spices from the Orient, fine cloth from Flanders, tools of remarkable craftsmanship from German lands. The world was growing larger, or perhaps it was only that we were becoming more aware of its largeness. And still, through all these changes, we drank beer instead of water. New generations were born knowing nothing else. Children grew to adulthood having never tasted water, except perhaps as a curiosity or a dare among boys trying to prove their courage to one another. The practice had become so deeply embedded in our way of life that its origins were forgotten by most people. They drank beer because that was what people did, not because they understood the dangers of water or remembered the plagues that had taught us this lesson. I found this forgetting troubling, though I could not articulate exactly why. Perhaps it was because I feared that if the knowledge was lost, if people ceased to understand why we brewed and drank as we did, they might become careless. They might begin to cut corners, to water down their beer excessively, to drink from sources they should not trust, and then the sickness would return, and we would have to learn the same hard lessons all over again. I tried, in my limited way, to preserve the knowledge. When young people came to the alehouse, I would sometimes tell them stories of the old days, of the droughts and plagues, of Brother Thomas and my mother and all the brewers who had kept the town alive through their skill and dedication. Some listened politely and forgot as soon as they walked out the door. Others seemed genuinely interested, asked questions, wanted to understand. To these few, I gave what wisdom I possessed, hoping it would not be entirely wasted. One such young person was my great-grandson, Thomas, named for the old monk, though the family connection was distant enough that I doubt anyone remembered the reason for the name. Thomas was perhaps 15 when he began to seek me out, sitting beside me for hours, listening to my rambling tales with a patience that seemed remarkable in one so young. He asked intelligent questions, not just about brewing, but about everything: the structure of the town, the workings of the guilds, the relationships between the monastery and the secular authorities, the changes I had witnessed over my long life. I grew fond of the boy. He reminded me of myself at that age, curious and observant, trying to make sense of a world that often seemed arbitrary and cruel. I told him things I had told no one else, not even Joan, my doubts and fears, my sense that we were living in a way that could not continue forever, that something fundamental would eventually change, and all our carefully maintained practices would be swept away by forces we could neither predict nor control. Thomas absorbed all of this solemnly, nodding, occasionally making notes on a piece of precious paper he had begged from the monastery scribes. He told me he wanted to write down the history of our town, to preserve it for future generations, who might otherwise know nothing of how their ancestors lived. I thought this a noble ambition, though I doubted he would find the time or resources to accomplish it. Life has a way of overwhelming such youthful projects with more immediate demands. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps Thomas did write his history. Perhaps somewhere, in some monastery archive or private collection, there exists a manuscript that tells the story I am telling now, in a hand younger and steadier than mine, with details I have forgotten and perspectives I could never possess. I would like to think so, though I will never know. The seasons turned, winter following summer following winter, each one blurring into the next, until I could no longer reliably remember which year a particular event had occurred. Time became a river, flowing past me while I sat on its bank, no longer swept along by its current but merely watching it pass. I grew frailer. My legs would no longer reliably support me, and I took to using a stick for walking, and then to remaining seated for most of the day, moving only when necessary. My sight dimmed, so that faces became blurred and indistinct, recognizable only by voice or gait. My hearing faded, though that was perhaps a mercy, as it spared me from the louder disturbances of the alehouse. Joan brought me my meals, and I ate what I could, though my appetite had largely departed. The only thing I still consumed with anything approaching enthusiasm was the small beer, the same weak, cloudy ale I had drunk every day of my life. Its taste was comfort, familiarity, the anchor that kept me connected to the world even as I drifted away from it. I began to have dreams, vivid and strange, in which I walked through the town as it had been in my childhood, seeing my parents young and strong, the streets crowded with faces I had not thought of in decades. Sometimes in these dreams I would stop at a well and look down into its depths, and I would see not water, but a darkness that seemed to have no bottom, a void that called to me in a voice I almost recognized. I would wake from these dreams with my heart racing, my breath shallow, unsure for a moment whether I was young or old, alive or merely lingering in some twilight state between life and the final sleep. Joan would hear me stirring and would come to check on me, bringing a cup of beer, speaking softly until I calmed and remembered where I was. I told her about the dreams, and she listened without judgment, though I could see the concern in her eyes. She asked if I was afraid, and I had to think carefully before answering. No, I said finally. Not afraid, but uncertain. I have lived so long, seen so much, and through it all, this one thing remained constant. The beer we brewed and drank, the protection it offered, the way it bound us together. When I am gone, will anyone remember why we did these things? Will anyone understand what it meant to live in a time when water could not be trusted, when survival depended on the skill of women like your grandmother, like your mother, like you? Joan took my hand in hers, and I felt the calluses on her palms, earned through decades of gripping the brewing paddle, lifting heavy pots, tending the fire. "I will remember," she said, "and I will teach my children, and they will teach theirs. The knowledge will not be lost." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that the understanding we had gained through suffering and experience would be passed down faithfully from generation to generation, that the hard lessons would not need to be relearned through fresh tragedy. But I had lived long enough to know that each generation must discover some truths for itself, that wisdom cannot simply be handed down like a pot or a crock of yeast. It must be earned. Still, I took comfort in her words, in the firmness of her grip, in the certainty of her voice. She would do her best. That was all anyone could do. The winter I turned 86 was harsh, though I barely felt it, wrapped as I was in blankets and sheepskins, kept warm by the fire that Joan fed constantly. Outside, snow fell for weeks, piling high in the streets, making travel difficult and commerce nearly impossible. The town turned inward, each household huddling around its own hearth, conserving fuel and food, waiting for the thaw that would surely come, for it always had before. I thought during those long winter days about all the winters I had survived, all the cold nights and frozen mornings, all the times when warmth and food and beer were uncertain, when survival was a daily struggle rather than an assumption. We had endured. We had found ways to adapt, to make do with what we had, to support one another through the worst times. This endurance was our greatest achievement, though it was not one that would be recorded in any chronicle or celebrated in any song. We were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a world that tested us constantly, and we survived by drinking beer instead of water, by boiling our wort and pitching our yeast, and serving the cloudy, nourishing ale to everyone who came to our doors with coin or need. This was our contribution to the great sweep of history, humble, unglamorous, essential. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the streets turned to mud, and then dried under a sun that grew stronger with each passing day. The fields greened, the first crops were planted, and life resumed its familiar rhythms. I watched all of this from my seat by the fire, content to observe rather than participate, to remember rather than do. And then, one morning in early summer, I woke to find that something had changed within me. I felt lighter, as if some burden I'd carried for so long, I'd ceased to notice it had been lifted away. My breath came easily without the usual effort. My sight was clearer than it had been in years. I could see individual leaves on the tree outside my window, see the patterns the sunlight made on the floor. I called for Joan, and she came quickly, alarmed by something in my voice. I told her what I was experiencing, and she looked at me with an expression I could not quite read concern, certainly, but also something that might have been recognition. "Rest now," she said, settling me back against my cushions. "I will stay with you." And she did. She sat beside me through that day and into the night, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, holding my hand when I reached for hers. Others came and went. My grandchildren, neighbours, the priest who prayed over me in Latin I could not understand, but whose intent was clear enough. I thanked them all, or tried to, though I am not certain my words were always coherent. As the light faded and the room grew dim, I found myself thinking one last time about beer, about water, about the choices we had made and the reasons we had made them. We had thought we were drinking to life, choosing the ale that nourished us over the water that threatened us, and in a sense, we were. But we were also drinking to forget how fragile our existence was, how little separated us from the final sleep, how much we depended on forces beyond our control or understanding. The water had turned against us, or perhaps it had always been against us, and we had only slowly come to realize it. And so we had turned to beer, not as a pleasure or a luxury, but as a necessity, as a way of transforming the dangerous into the safe, the threatening into the sustaining. We had become a people defined by this transformation, by this daily alchemy of grain and water and yeast into something that kept us alive. Was this a victory or a defeat? I'm still not certain. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? We had learned not to trust the most basic element of life, the water that falls from the sky and runs in every stream and fills every well. We had learned to be suspicious, to boil and ferment and process everything before we would allow it to pass our lips. We had learned, in short, that the world was not to be trusted, that safety was something we had to create for ourselves through constant vigilance and labour. Perhaps this was wisdom, perhaps it was merely sadness. The room grew darker still, or perhaps it was my eyes that dimmed. I could no longer make out Joan's face, though I could feel her hand in mine and hear her breathing beside me. I could smell, very faintly, the familiar scent of beer brewing somewhere below. Joan must have left a pot on the fire, tending to the work even as she sat with me. The smell was comforting, a final reminder of everything I had known and been. I thought of my mother at her brewing pot, of Brother Thomas in the monastery cellars, of Alice stirring the mash on a winter morning, of all the countless brewers who had lived and worked and died, each one adding their skill and knowledge to the great tradition that had sustained us. I thought of the children yet to be born, who would drink the beer their mothers brewed without understanding why, without remembering what we had learned at such cost. And I thought of the water, the clear, cold, treacherous water that had shaped our lives so completely, that had forced us to become who we were. I thought of it flowing in the river outside our walls, running in the wells beneath our streets, falling from the sky in the form of rain that we collected and boiled and transformed into beer. The water was still there, still moving, still waiting. It had not changed. We had changed. We had adapted to its treachery, had found ways to circumvent its dangers, had survived despite it. But we had not conquered it. We had only learned to live with it, to work around it, to never fully trust it again. This, I realized as the darkness gathered closer, was what we were. Not a people who drank beer for joy, but a people who drank beer because we had to, because the alternative was sickness and the final sleep, because we had learned through bitter experience that the world was not always kind to those who trusted it without question. We thought we drank to life, but perhaps we drank to forget that the water had turned against us. Joan's hand tightened on mine, and I heard her voice, distant now, as if coming from a great distance. She was speaking, though I could not make out the words. I wanted to answer, to offer some final wisdom, some insight that would make sense of it all. But no words came. I'd said everything I needed to say. I had lived my life, had done my work, had passed on what knowledge I could to those who came after me. The rest was up to them. The darkness became complete, and I felt myself drifting, letting go, allowing the current to carry me at last. And as I drifted, I could taste one final time the familiar flavour of small beer on my tongue, cloudy and slightly sweet, warm from the cellar, tasting of malt and yeast and survival. It was the taste of my entire life, distilled into a single moment of memory. And then even that faded, and there was only silence and peace, and the certain knowledge that the work would continue without me, that Joan and her children and their children after them would keep brewing, keep boiling, keep transforming the dangerous into the safe, one pot at a time, one cup at a time, one life at a time. The water would always be there, waiting. But so too would the beer, the ancient solution to an ancient problem, the thread that connected us to our ancestors and would connect us to our descendants, however far into the future they might live. We drank beer instead of water because we had no choice, and in having no choice we created something that sustained us, that brought us together, that gave meaning to our labour and purpose to our days. This was our legacy, humble and unglamorous as it was. We survived. That, in the end, was enough. In memory of all those who brewed and drank through the long centuries when water could not be trusted, who kept the old knowledge alive through plague and drought and famine, who understood that sometimes survival requires us to transform what we fear into what we need. May their work never be forgotten, and may we never take for granted the safety of what we drink.